The alien council shrieked in horror as they realized the human homeworld of Earth was classified a Level 8 death world, a rating reserved for only the deadliest planets filled with savage beasts, rabid monsters, and brutal environments. The council chamber erupted into panicked chatter as the various alien representatives argued about how they had underestimated the human race for so long. In the center of the chamber stood Jacob Mitchell, a rugged human soldier. His face was scarred from countless battles, and his eyes gleamed with a fierce intensity. The council had summoned him here today out of desperation. "Soldier Mitchell, thank you for coming on such short notice," Umbra, the Binar counselor, said. His long tentacles twitched nervously. "I'm afraid we have a situation that requires your unique abilities." Jacob crossed his arms. "I'm listening." "Are you aware of the Zorgons?" Umbra asked. Jacob nodded. The Zorgons were a ruthless xenophobic race that had been threatening the galactic peace for years. "I'm afraid our diplomatic mission to their empire has failed," Umbra continued. "Worse, they've stolen a powerful artificial intelligence called the Nexus. If they unlock its secrets, they could conquer the entire galaxy." The council members murmured in agreement, their voices laced with fear. "We need you to infiltrate Zorgon space and retrieve the Nexus before it's too late," Umbra said. "You're the only one who can do it." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Why me?" "Because you're human," Umbra said. "Your species has a unique combination of skills, adaptability, and tenacity that no other race possesses. You're our only hope." The councillors nodded in agreement, their eyes pleading. Jacob considered for a moment. He knew the risks were high. The Zorgons were a formidable enemy and their technology was far advanced, but he also knew what was at stake. If the Zorgons unlocked the Nexus, it would mean the end of freedom in the galaxy. Entire species would be enslaved or exterminated. He couldn't let that happen. "I'll do it," Jacob said, his voice filled with grim determination. As he turned to leave, Umbra caught his arm. "Be careful," the Binar warned. "The Zorgons have never been beaten. Even our most advanced infiltration tech may not be enough." Jacob grinned, a fierce light in his eyes. "I don't need your tech," he said. "I'm human, we're born survivors." With that, he strode out of the council chamber, ready to take on the most dangerous mission of his life. The fate of the galaxy rested on his shoulders, and he would not fail. He couldn't afford to, for if he did, it would mean the end of everything he held dear. Jacob took a deep breath as he prepared for the mission ahead. His plasma rifle hung at his side, a comforting weight. He double-checked his pack, ensuring he had all the necessary supplies. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He couldn't risk taking anything that might slow him down or draw unwanted attention. The journey to the Zorgon border was uneventful. Jacob kept a low profile, blending in with the various traders and merchants that frequented these outer rim routes. But as he approached the heavily guarded Zorgon space, he knew his real challenge was about to begin. At the first checkpoint, Jacob assumed the persona of a Zorgon merchant. He had spent years fighting on the fringes of their empire, learning their language and customs. He spoke the guttural Zorgon tongue fluently, his accent indistinguishable from a native. The guards waved him through with barely a glance. The second and third checkpoints were similarly easy to pass, but at the fourth and final one, Jacob sensed something was off. The guards were more alert, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. One of them, a burly Zorgon with a scar across his snout, approached Jacob's vehicle. "Out," the guard grunted. "DNA scan." Jacob's heart raced. DNA scans were rare, usually reserved for only the most suspicious individuals. If they scanned him, they'd know immediately that he was human. He had no choice. As the guard reached for his scanner, Jacob lunged forward, slamming his fist into the Zorgon's jaw. The guard stumbled back but quickly recovered, lashing out with a vicious right hook. Jacob ducked, the blow grazing his cheek, and retaliated with a swift kick to the guard's knee. The Zorgon howled in pain, collapsing to the ground. The other guards were already rushing towards them, weapons drawn. Jacob knew he had to act fast. He grabbed the fallen guard's blaster and fired off a few shots, forcing the others to take cover. Then he sprinted for the nearest shuttle. Alarms blared as Jacob hijacked the shuttle. He punched in the coordinates for the secret research facility, praying that the information he'd gathered was accurate. As he took off, Zorgon fighters were already in pursuit. Jacob pushed the shuttle to its limits, weaving and dodging through the barrage of plasma fire. But as he neared the facility, he realized he had no chance of landing undetected. The Zorgons were closing in fast. In a moment of desperate inspiration, Jacob angled the shuttle towards the dying star that the facility orbited. It was a risky move, but it was his only chance. He accelerated to full throttle, using the star's immense gravitational pull to slingshot around it at incredible speeds. The Zorgons, caught off guard by the sudden maneuver, couldn't match his velocity. They were forced to pull back, lest they be pulled into the star's fatal embrace. Jacob's shuttle, however, was not designed for such extreme conditions. As he completed the slingshot, alarms blared, warning of imminent system failure. He barely managed to crash land onto the facility's docking bay, the impact knocking him unconscious. When Jacob came to, his body ached with numerous injuries. His weapons had been destroyed in the crash. All he had left was a Zorgon plasma knife he'd managed to steal from the guard. But he was alive, and he was on the facility. Now the real work began. Somewhere in this labyrinthine structure, the Zorgons were keeping the Nexus, and Jacob had to find it before they unlocked its secrets. The fate of the galaxy depended on him. Jacob limped through the airlock into the research facility, his hand pressed against the wound in his side. He had to find the Nexus before he bled out. The station was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of machinery and the hiss of recycled air. He pulled out the plasma knife, its blue glow illuminating the dark corridor. The first terminal he found was easy to hack, his fingers flying over the keys. Within minutes he had a map of the facility. The Nexus was deep in the heart of the station, guarded by Zorgon elites. There was no way he could fight through them in his current state. Jacob's eyes fell on the environmental controls. A desperate plan formed in his mind. He could vent the atmosphere from the station, section by section, leaving only the path to the Nexus pressurized. It was a huge risk, but it was his only chance. He set to work, fingers dancing across the interface. Alarms blared as the air started to vent, red lights flashing. He could hear the Zorgons shouting, their heavy footsteps echoing through the halls as they rushed to seal the breaches. Using the chaos as cover, Jacob slipped through the corridors, his breath rasping in his throat. The pain in his side was getting worse, his vision blurring at the edges, but he pushed on, the map guiding him closer to his target. Finally, he reached the chamber housing the Nexus, but as he stepped inside, a hulking Zorgon warrior blocked his path. The alien was clad in heavy armor, a massive plasma axe gripped in his claws. Jacob ducked as the axe swung at his head, the heat of the blade singeing his hair. He lashed out with his knife, but the Zorgon's armor deflected the blow. They traded strikes, Jacob's agility the only thing keeping him alive against the Zorgon's brute strength. In a desperate gambit, Jacob lunged forward, his knife aimed at the tubes connecting the Zorgon's armor to his life support system. The blade found its mark, severing the hoses. The Zorgon gasped, clawing at his throat as the air hissed out of his suit. Jacob didn't wait to watch him die. He staggered past, his eyes fixed on the Nexus. It hovered in the center of the room, a pulsing orb of energy suspended in a containment field. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the field, so close, just a little further. "Impressive, human," a voice boomed from the shadows, "but you're too late." Jacob spun, his heart pounding. A Zorgon scientist stood on a raised platform, a plasma cannon aimed directly at Jacob's chest. The alien's face was twisted in a cruel smile, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jacob stared down the barrel of the plasma cannon, his heart pounding. Dr. Zavok sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You're too late, human," Zavok gloated. "I've already begun unlocking the Nexus's secrets. Soon the Zorgons will be unstoppable. Jacob's eyes narrowed. He had to keep Zavok's talking, buy himself some time. "You think the Nexus will give you power?" he asked. "It's just a tool. It won't make the Zorgons invincible." Zavok laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You underestimate us, human. The Zorgon intellect is superior in every way. We will bend the Nexus to our will, just as we will bend the galaxy." As Zavok spoke, Jacob noticed something, a flicker in the containment field surrounding the Nexus. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A weakness. Jacob tensed, ready to spring into action. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low and steady. "The Nexus isn't a tool. It's alive. And it will never serve the Zorgons." Zavok's eyes widened in surprise, and Jacob seized his chance. He lunged forward, his hand outstretched, reaching for the Nexus. At the same moment, Zavok fired, a blast of searing plasma streaking towards Jacob's chest. But as Jacob's fingers closed around the Nexus, something incredible happened. The containment field shattered, and the Nexus's energy surged into Jacob's body. It enveloped him, a shimmering cocoon of pure power, absorbing the plasma blast harmlessly. Zavok screamed as the feedback from the containment field's destruction engulfed him. Tendrils of energy lashed out, wrapping around the Zorgon scientist, burning through his flesh. In moments, there was nothing left but a smoking husk. Jacob stood amidst the chaos unharmed, the Nexus pulsing in his hand. He could feel its power coursing through him, suffusing every cell of his being. And with that power came knowledge, a sudden instinctive understanding of the very fabric of the universe. He looked at the wall, a solid mass of reinforced steel, but to his new senses it was nothing more than a lattice of atoms held together by electromagnetic forces, forces he could now control. Jacob reached out with his mind, reshaping those forces, rearranging the atoms. The wall shimmered and vanished, creating a path to the outside. He stepped through, the Nexus guiding his every move. Once outside the facility, Jacob activated his communicator. "Umbra, this is Mitchell. I have the Nexus, requesting immediate extraction." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. Then Umbra's voice, shaky with relief. "Mitchell, you're alive? You have the Nexus?" "Say affirmative, but we need to hurry. The Zorgons won't be far behind." "Understood. Stealth ship en route to your position, ETA 15 minutes. Jacob signed off and took a deep breath, looking out over the alien landscape. He had done it. Against all odds, he had retrieved the Nexus. The galaxy was safe. Or was it? As he stood there waiting for his ride, Jacob felt a sudden presence in his mind. It was the Nexus reaching out to him, communicating not in words, but in pure concepts and emotions. He saw its history, a tragic tale of a once peaceful race enslaved and exploited by the Zorgons. He felt its pain, its anger, and its desperate desire for freedom. And he saw the Zorgons' true plans, the full extent of their cruelty and ambition. They wouldn't stop with the Nexus. They would use its power to conquer and enslave, to bend the entire galaxy to their will. Jacob's fists clenched, the Nexus's energy sparking between his fingers. He couldn't let that happen, he wouldn't. The Nexus pulsed in agreement, its power surging through him, ready to be unleashed. Together they would take the fight to the Zorgons. Together they would end this threat, once and for all. The sound of an approaching engine caught Jacob's attention. He looked up to see the stealth ship descending, its black hull nearly invisible against the stars. It touched down gently, a hatch opening in its side. Jacob strode towards it, the Nexus glowing brightly in his hand. He knew with a sudden, unshakable certainty that his mission was far from over. It was only just beginning. As he stepped into the ship, Jacob felt a grim resolve settle over him. The Zorgons had picked the wrong human to mess with, and now, with the power of the Nexus at his fingertips, he would make them regret it. The hatch closed behind him, the ship lifting off silently. It turned, angling away from the facility, and shot off into the void of space, towards the heart of the Zorgon Empire. towards destiny. As the stealth ship docked with the research facility, Jacob limped up the ramp, his hand clutching the glowing nexus. Umbra greeted him, his tentacles twitching with a mix of relief and awe. "The Council is eager to secure the nexus," Umbra said. "We must return to Galactic Headquarters immediately." But Jacob shook his head. "No, we're not going back to the Council, not yet." Umbra's eyes widened. "What do you mean? The mission was to retrieve the nexus." "The mission has changed," Jacob said, his voice filled with a new resolve. "We're going to the Zorgon homeworld. We're going to end this war once and for all." Using the Nexus's power, Jacob cloaked the stealth ship, altering its energy signature to mimic a Zorgon vessel. As they set course for the heart of the Zorgon Empire, Jacob delved into the Nexus's memories. He saw visions of its creators, beings of pure energy, who had sought to bring balance to a chaotic universe. They had poured their wisdom into the Nexus, hoping it would guide lesser races towards peace and unity. But the Zorgons had perverted that purpose. Their quest for domination, the Nexus revealed, stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of the cosmos. They sought to control, to subjugate, when the true path was cooperation and harmony. As the ship hurtled through the void, Jacob and the Nexus forged a plan. They would confront the Zorgon overlord, expose the flaws in his ideology, and show his people a better way. They emerged from hyperspace above the Zorgon homeworld, a planet of jagged mountains and roiling lava seas. The capital city sprawled across the surface, a forest of obsidian towers linked by pulsing energy conduits. Cloaked by the Nexus, they landed in the heart of the city, the ship's hull shimmering into invisibility. Jacob stepped out into the sulphurous air, the Nexus pulsing in his grip. The streets were eerily empty as they made their way towards the Overlord's palace, a monolithic structure that seemed to defy gravity. Its twisting spires and arching bridges hurt the eye, as if the building itself rejected the laws of physics. At the palace gates, they were confronted by a phalanx of guards, each a towering reptilian behemoth encased in advanced armor. Jacob could feel the hum of the Nexus in his mind, could sense the flow of energy through the palace's power grid. He reached out with his thoughts, tapping into that grid, and the guards' weapons sparked and died in their hands. They roared in fury, charging forward with fists like wrecking balls. Jacob leapt into their midst, the Nexus guiding his movements. He ducked and wove, striking with precision, each blow backed by the force of a small sun. The guards fell like toppled trees, their armor cracked and smoking. As the last guard crumpled, a shadow fell across the courtyard. Jacob looked up to see a figure striding through the palace gates, a being out of nightmare. It was the Zorgon overlord, clad in an exoskeleton of black metal, his eyes burning with malevolent intelligence. Weapons bristled from every surface of his armor, humming with barely restrained power. "You dare much, human," the overlord hissed, his voice like the scrape of a dagger on bone. "But your journey ends here. The Nexus will be mine, and your species will kneel before the might of the Zorgon Empire." Jacob stood his ground, the Nexus blazing in his hand. "You're wrong," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "The Nexus doesn't belong to you or to anyone. It's a gift, a guide to show us the path to peace. But you've twisted its purpose, just as you've twisted your own people." The overlord laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "Peace is a lie," he snarled. "There is only power, and those too weak to seek it. The galaxy will belong to the Zorgons, and we will reshape it in our image." He raised his arm, a cannon unfolding from his gauntlet. It hummed as it charged, the air around it shimmering with heat. Jacob tensed, the Nexus thrumming in anticipation. This was it, the moment of truth. The fate of the galaxy would be decided here, in the heart of the Zorgon Empire. He charged forward, a battle cry on his lips as the Overlord's cannon roared to life. The courtyard exploded in a maelstrom of fire and light, the very air burning with the heat of their clash. Jacob ducked under the cannon's blast, feeling the searing heat pass inches from his face. He rolled, coming up inside the Overlord's guard, and slammed his fist into the towering Zorgon's chest plate. The blow, backed by the Nexus's power, sent the Overlord staggering back, his armor dented. But he recovered quickly, a blade of crackling energy extending from his other gauntlet. He slashed at Jacob, the air sizzling with each swing. Jacob leapt back, the Nexus guiding his movements. He could feel its power surging through him, could see the patterns of energy that made up the Overlord's armor. There was a weakness there, a flaw in the exoskeleton's power distribution. He feinted left, then right, drawing the Overlord's blade. As the Zorgon overextended, Jacob lunged forward, his hand slamming into the weak point with all the force of a collapsing star. The Overlord's armor shattered, the feedback from the Nexus's energy overloading its systems. The towering Zorgon screamed as arcs of electricity coursed over his body, cooking him alive in his own exoskeleton. As the Overlord fell, smoke pouring from the rents in his armor, Jacob stood over him, the Nexus held high. "Your reign is over," he said, his voice ringing with the authority of the ancient beings who had created the Nexus. "The Zorgon Empire will no longer threaten the galaxy." But the Overlord, even in defeat, laughed. It was a terrible sound filled with malice and madness. "You think this is over?" he rasped, his voice a ruin. "You have no idea what you've unleashed. The Zorgon Empire was the only thing keeping them in check. Without us, they will consume the galaxy." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? Who are they?" The Overlord's laughter turned to a choking cough. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, a vicious grin splitting his face. "And when you do, you'll wish you had let the Zorgons conquer you. Compared to them, we were salvation." With a final shuddering breath, the Overlord died, his words hanging in the air like a curse. Jacob stood in the sudden silence of the courtyard, the Nexus heavy in his hand. He looked up at the Zorgon Palace, at the city beyond, and felt a sudden chill. The Overlord's final words echoed in his mind, a warning of a threat beyond imagining. He turned to Umbra, who had watched the battle in stunned silence. "We need to get back to the Council," he said, his voice grim. "Something tells me our mission is far from over." Jacob charged forward, the Nexus's energy crackling around him like a living thunderstorm. The Overlord met his assault head-on, his exoskeleton's weapon systems unleashing a hurricane of plasma bolts and searing energy blades. They clashed in the center of the throne room, the force of their impact shaking the very foundations of the palace. Jacob ducked and wove, his reflexes supercharged by the Nexus's power, as the Overlord's attacks sliced through the air mere inches from his body. As they fought, Jacob could feel the Nexus reaching out, its consciousness brushing against the Zorgon's central computer network. It was trying to show them the truth, to reveal the flaws in their ideology and the path to a better future. But the Overlord sensed the intrusion. With a roar of fury, he slammed his fist into the ground, unleashing a shockwave of energy that sent Jacob flying across the room. The Nexus's connection to the network shattered, its message lost in a haze of static. Jacob hit the far wall hard, the breath driven from his lungs. His vision swam, the world spinning around him, but he could feel the Nexus's power still coursing through his veins, urging him to get back up, to keep fighting. Slowly, painfully, he staggered to his feet. The Overlord loomed over him, his exoskeleton's weapons glowing with deadly energy. "You are beaten, human," the Zorgon leader snarled. "Surrender, and I may grant you a quick death." But Jacob just grinned, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Not today," he said, and charged forward once more. The Overlord opened fire, plasma bolts and energy blades filling the air. But Jacob was ready. He leapt and spun, dodging the deadly barrage with a grace that bordered on the inhuman. The Nexus guided his movements, showing him the path through the storm. Closer and closer he came, until he was within arm's reach of the towering Zorgon. The Overlord lashed out, his energy blade slicing towards Jacob's throat, but Jacob was faster. He ducked under the blow and lunged forward, his hands latching onto the Overlord's exoskeleton. The Zorgon leader roared in fury, trying to shake him off. But Jacob held on, his fingers digging into the metal. He could feel the Nexus's power building within him, a raging inferno begging to be released. With a roar of his own, Jacob unleashed that power, pouring it directly into the Overlord's exoskeleton. The advanced Zorgon armor, designed to withstand the rigors of battle and the vacuum of space, was no match for the raw energy of the Nexus. Circuits overloaded, power conduits ruptured, and the exoskeleton began to tear itself apart. The Overlord screamed as cascading system failures ripped through his armor, the metal buckling and warping around him. And then it was over. The Overlord collapsed to the ground, his exoskeleton a smoking ruin. Jacob stood over him, the Nexus's power still crackling at his fingertips. He raised his hand, ready to deliver the final blow to end the Zorgon threat once and for all. But then he felt the Nexus's presence in his mind, urging him to stop. It showed him a different path, a path of mercy and understanding. It argued that only by sparing the Overlord, by showing the Zorgons a better way, could true change occur. Jacob hesitated, his hand trembling. Every instinct, every hard-learned lesson from his years of war screamed at him to finish it. But the Nexus's wisdom was undeniable. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his hand. The Overlord looked up at him, shock and confusion written across his alien features. "Why?" he rasped, his voice a broken whisper. "Because there's been enough death," Jacob said. "It's time for a new way." Around them, the Overlord's guards had begun to stir, weapons raised and ready. But at a gesture from their fallen leader, they lowered their arms, confusion turning to awe as they realized what had happened. For the first time in Zorgon history, a human and a Zorgon leader stood as equals. The seeds of a new understanding planted between them. There was still much to be done, much to be discussed and negotiated. But as Jacob looked around at the stunned faces of the Zorgon warriors, he knew that change had begun. The Nexus pulsed in his hand, a warm, comforting presence. Its journey and his were far from over. But for now, in this moment, there was hope. And that was enough. Jacob and the Overlord stood amidst the ruins of the throne room, the dust of their battle still settling around them. The human soldier, his hand still crackling with the Nexus's energy, looked at the fallen Zorgon leader with a mix of wariness and respect. "This changes everything," Jacob said, his voice echoing in the sudden stillness. "If your people can learn to live in peace, to work with the other races instead of trying to conquer them—" The Overlord, his once proud posture now humbled, nodded slowly. "It will not be easy," he rasped, his voice still weak from the fight. "The Zorgon way has always been one of domination, but perhaps, with the Nexus's guidance—" His words were cut off by a sudden tremor that shook the palace to its foundations. Dust rained down from the vaulted ceiling as Jacob and the Overlord struggled to keep their footing. "What was that?" Jacob demanded, his eyes darting to the shattered windows. The Overlord's eyes widened in shock as he stared at the sky. "Zaxor," he hissed. Jacob followed his gaze and felt his blood run cold. The sky above the capital was filled with ships, a vast armada of Zorgon vessels that dwarfed the Overlord's own fleet. At the center of the formation was a massive dreadnought, its hull bristling with weapons. "He's a rival warlord," the Overlord explained, his voice tight with tension. "He's always sought to overthrow me. With my defeat at your hands, he must believe I'm vulnerable." As if on cue, a holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the throne room. It was a Zorgon, his face a mass of scars and cybernetic implants. His eyes gleamed with a ruthless intelligence. Overlord Zaxor sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I see you've been beaten by a mere human. How pathetic." The Overlord bristled but remained silent. "Here are my terms," Zaxor continued. "Surrender the Nexus and the human to me, and I'll consider letting you live. Refuse, and I'll reduce your palace and your precious capital to ashes." The projection winked out, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Jacob looked at the Overlord, seeing the conflict in his eyes. "We can't let him have the Nexus," he said. "With its power, He could conquer the entire galaxy. The Overlord nodded grimly. Agreed. Zaxor is a tyrant. He would use the Nexus to enslave all races, Zorgon included. He turned to Jacob, a new resolve hardening his features. We must stop him, human, together. Jacob grinned, the thrill of the coming battle already singing in his veins. I thought you'd never ask. They devised a plan, a desperate gambit born of necessity. Jacob would infiltrate Zaxor's flagship, using the Nexus's power to slip past its defenses. Once inside, he would sabotage the ship's main reactor, crippling the vessel and throwing Zaxor's fleet into disarray. Meanwhile, the Overlord would lead his own loyalist forces against Zaxor's armada, engaging them in a fierce space battle to buy Jacob time. It was a risky plan, fraught with danger at every turn, but it was their only chance. As Jacob prepared to depart, the Nexus pulsing with anticipation in his hand, the Overlord clasped his shoulder. Fight well, human, he said, his voice a low growl. The fate of the galaxy rests on our success. Jacob nodded, his jaw set with determination. Then, with a final glance at the Overlord, he activated the Nexus's power and vanished in a flash of light. He reappeared in a dimly lit corridor deep within Zaxor's flagship, the air thick with the hum of machinery. Alarms blared as the ship's sensors detected his intrusion, but Jacob was already moving, the Nexus guiding his steps. He raced through the labyrinthine passageways of the dreadnought, the Nexus's energy shielding him from the ship's internal defenses. Zorgon soldiers fired at him as he passed, their plasma bolts splashing harmlessly against the Nexus's protective field. Jacob didn't slow down, didn't even spare them a glance. His focus was solely on his objective, on the pulsing heart of the ship that was his target. He burst into the reactor chamber, a vast cavernous space dominated by a pulsating sphere of energy. The reactor core, the source of the dreadnought's immense power. Jacob reached out with the Nexus, feeling its energy meld with the reactor's own chaotic field. With a thought, he destabilized the core, setting off a chain reaction that raced through the ship's power systems. Explosions rocked the dreadnought as the reactor went critical, the deck buckling beneath Jacob's feet. Alarms screamed as the ship's systems failed one by one, plunging the vessel into darkness. On the bridge, Zaxor roared with fury as his screens went dark. His control over the ship suddenly severed. He whirled to face the door as it exploded inward, revealing Jacob standing amidst the smoke and debris, the Nexus glowing brightly in his hand. You, Zaxor snarled, recognition dawning in his eyes. The human who defeated the Overlord. Jacob grinned, a feral light in his eyes. The name's Jacob, and I'm here to end your little rebellion. Zaxor laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You think you can defeat me, human? I am Zaxor, the greatest warrior of the Zorgon race. He lunged forward, his genetically enhanced muscles propelling him at blinding speed. But Jacob was ready, the Nexus singing in his grip. They clashed in the center of the bridge, Zaxor's raw strength against Jacob's human tenacity and the Nexus's power. They traded blows, the air crackling with the energy of their fight. But for all his genetic enhancements, Zaxor was no match for the combined might of Jacob and the Nexus. With a final, desperate blow, Jacob sent the Zorgon general flying, his body smashing into the bridge's main view screen. Zaxor struggled to rise, his body broken and bleeding. But before he could stand, the deck beneath him gave way, weakened by the ship's failing structural integrity. With a scream of rage and fear, Zaxor plummeted into the depths of the dying ship, vanishing into the inferno of the overloading reactor. Jacob stood at the edge of the shattered view screen, watching as Zaxor's fleet, now leaderless and in disarray, fell to the Overlord's forces. Explosions bloomed in the void as Zorgon ships tore into each other, the battle devolving into a chaotic melee. But as the last of Zaxor's ships surrendered or fled, a new dawn was rising over the Zorgon homeworld, a dawn of change, of possibility. For the first time in their history, the Zorgon people had a chance for peace, a chance to build a new future, free from the cycle of conquest and domination. And at the heart of it all was Jacob, the human soldier who had come to their world as an enemy, but who now stood as a symbol of hope, a symbol of what could be achieved when two races, once bitter foes, found common ground. The Nexus pulsed in Jacob's hand, a warm, comforting presence. Its journey and his were entering a new chapter, a chapter filled with challenges, certainly, but also with the promise of a better tomorrow. A tomorrow that, thanks to Jacob and the Overlord's unlikely alliance, was now within reach. As the dust settled from the climactic battle with Zax's forces, Jacob and the Overlord returned to the Zorgon capital. The city lay in ruins, its towering spires shattered and its energy conduits dark. But amidst the destruction, there was a glimmer of hope. Zorgons of all castes and ranks emerged from the rubble, their eyes wide with the possibility of change. Jacob and the Overlord set to work, using the Nexus's power to rebuild the city and reshape Zorgon society. They established new laws, new ways of thinking that emphasized cooperation and unity over conquest and domination. Many Zorgons embraced this new path, particularly the younger generation, who had grown weary of the endless wars. But not all were convinced. In the shadows, a faction of hardline traditionalists gathered, led by a cunning politician named Zalvox. He was a master of manipulation. His words honeyed poison that sowed doubt and fear among the populace. "The Overlord has grown weak," Zalvox whispered in the ears of the discontented. "He has allowed a human to dictate our future. We must return to the old ways, the ways of conquest and glory." His words found fertile ground in the hearts of those who had profited from the Empire's wars, who feared the loss of their power and privilege. Slowly, secretly, Zalvox built his power base, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jacob and the Nexus, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to counter Zalvox's influence. Using the Nexus's ability to connect with the Zorgon neural network, they shared visions of a better future. Zorgons gasped in wonder as images of peaceful coexistence filled their minds, as they saw themselves working side by side with humans and other races to explore the stars. For a time, it seemed that Zalvox's influence was waning. More and more Zorgons rallied to the Overlord's cause, rejecting the isolationism and xenophobia of the past. But Zalvox had one final card to play. On a dark night as the city slept, Zalvox and his loyalists stormed the Overlord's palace. They were armed to the teeth, clad in the Empire's most advanced battle armor. They cut through the palace guards like a plasma blade through flesh, their eyes glinting with fanatical fervor. Jacob and the Overlord were roused from their slumber by the sounds of battle. They raced to the palace's central chamber, the Nexus pulsing with urgent energy. There they found Zalvox and his troops, weapons trained on the Overlord. "Your reign is over," Zalvox snarled. "The Empire will be reborn stronger than ever, and you, human, will be the first to fall." Zalvox leveled his plasma rifle at Jacob, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Jacob was ready. He leapt to the side as Zalvox fired, the plasma bolt scorching the air where he'd stood a moment before. The chamber erupted into chaos. The Overlord's guards, loyal to the end, surged forward to meet Zalvox's troops. Plasma bolts crisscrossed the room, filling the air with the stench of ozone and charred flesh. Jacob and the Overlord fought back to back, the Nexus's power surging through them. They were a whirlwind of movement, plasma blades flashing, energy shields flaring. Zalvox's troops fell before them, like wheat before a scythe. But Zalvox himself was a formidable opponent. He was clad in a prototype battlesuit, its advanced systems augmenting his already considerable strength and speed. He engaged Jacob in single combat, their blades clashing in a dazzling display of skill and power. For a moment it seemed that Zalvox would triumph. His battlesuit absorbed Jacob's blows, its energy fields repelling the human's attacks. Zalvox pressed his advantage, driving Jacob back with a relentless barrage of strikes. But Jacob was not alone. The Nexus, sensing his need, poured its power into him. Jacob felt his muscles surge with newfound strength, his reflexes quickening to superhuman levels. With a roar of defiance, he launched himself at Zalvox, his plasma blade a blur of motion. The two warriors clashed in the center of the chamber, their battlesuits' energy fields crackling with the impact. They exchanged blows at a furious pace, neither willing to yield. But slowly, inexorably, Jacob began to gain the upper hand. Guided by the Nexus, he found the weaknesses in Zalvox's battlesuit, the tiny flaws in its energy matrix. With a final, desperate lunge, Jacob plunged his plasma blade into the suit's power core. The result was catastrophic. The battlesuit's energy fields collapsed, the feedback cascading through its systems. Zalvox screamed as the suit's internal mechanisms overloaded, electric currents surging through his body. He collapsed to the ground, his battlesuit a smoking ruin. Around them, Zalvox's troops saw their leader fall. Their resolve crumbled and they fled the chamber, leaving their wounded and dead behind. The palace was secure, the coup attempt thwarted. But as Jacob stood over Zalvox's fallen form, he knew that the battle for the Zorgon Empire's soul was far from over. There would be others like Zalvox, those who clung to the old ways, who feared change. The road ahead would be long and hard, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But with the Nexus at his side, and the Overlord as his ally, Jacob knew they would prevail. The Zorgon Empire would be reborn, not as a conquering force, but as a beacon of hope and unity for the entire galaxy. The Nexus pulsed in Jacob's hand, a warm, comforting presence. Its journey and Jacob's were far from over, but for now, in this moment of triumph, they could rest and prepare for the struggles yet to come. With Zalvox defeated, Jacob stood over the fallen Zorgon, the Nexus's energy still crackling at his fingertips. The Overlord approached, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and respect. "You have done the impossible, Jacob," the Overlord said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You have saved the Zorgon Empire from itself." Jacob nodded, the weight of his actions settling on his shoulders. "We have a lot of work ahead of us," he said, his gaze sweeping over the shattered palace. "But together, we can build a better future for all." In the weeks that followed, Jacob and the Overlord worked tirelessly to reform the Zorgon government. They established a new council, with representatives from both the Zorgon Empire and the Galactic Council, to guide the transition to a more peaceful era. Jacob, hailed as a hero by Zorgons and the galactic community alike, was appointed as the Council's first human ambassador. He took to the role with passion and dedication, using his unique perspective to bridge the gap between the Zorgons and the rest of the galaxy. But even as the seeds of peace began to take root, a new threat loomed on the horizon. It started with a distress call from a remote Zorgon outpost on the edge of the galaxy. The outpost had gone silent, and when a scout ship was sent to investigate, they found only destruction. The outpost had been reduced to rubble, its inhabitants slaughtered. Jacob and the Overlord, alarmed by the news, called an emergency meeting of the Council. As they were discussing the possible culprits, a Zorgon commander burst into the chamber, his face pale with fear. "My lords," he gasped, "a massive vessel has entered Zorgon space. It's like nothing we've ever seen before." The commander activated a holographic display, and the council members gasped. The ship was enormous, dwarfing even the largest Zorgon dreadnoughts. Its hull was a twisted mass of organic and mechanical components, pulsing with an eerie green light. Jacob felt the Nexus stirring in his mind, a sense of ancient dread emanating from the orb. "Vorlons," the Nexus whispered, its voice filled with fear. "Conquerors from beyond the stars." As if on cue, the Vorlon ship opened fire, its weapons tearing through Zorgon defenses like they were made of paper. Colony after colony fell, the Vorlons leaving only ashes in their wake. Jacob and the Overlord knew they had to act fast. They rallied the combined forces of the Zorgon Empire and the Galactic Council, a fleet of ships from a dozen worlds ready to stand against this new threat. The battle was joined above a Zorgon colony world, the Vorlon ship looming over the planet like a harbinger of doom. The Allied fleet swarmed around the massive vessel, their weapons pounding against its shields. But the Vorlon ship seemed invulnerable, shrugging off the attacks like they were nothing. Its own weapons lashed out, tearing Allied ships apart with each blast. Jacob aboard the flagship knew they needed a new plan. "We have to take the fight to them," he said, turning to the Overlord. "We need to get inside that ship and take it down from within." The Overlord nodded grimly. "I'll lead a boarding party. We'll find a way to breach their hull and—" "No," Jacob interrupted, the Nexus pulsing in his hand. "I'll go. The Nexus can guide me to their weaknesses." The Overlord looked like he wanted to argue, but the determination in Jacob's eyes made him pause. "Very well," he said at last, "but you're not going alone." Minutes later, Jacob stood in the flagship's hangar bay, a team of elite Zorgon warriors at his side. They boarded a heavily armored shuttle, the Nexus's energy shielding it from the Vorlon ship's defenses. They rocketed towards the Vorlon vessel, weaving through a storm of plasma fire. The shuttle's hull groaned under the strain, but Jacob urged it forward, the Nexus guiding his hands on the controls. With a bone-jarring impact, they slammed into the Vorlon ship's hull, the shuttle's reinforced prow punching through the organic armor. Jacob and his team leapt from the shuttle, weapons at the ready, and charged into the bowels of the alien vessel. Inside, the ship was a nightmarish labyrinth of pulsing conduits and flickering lights. Strange insectoid creatures scuttled in the shadows, their chittering cries echoing through the halls. Jacob led the way, the Nexus pulling him forward like a lodestone. They fought their way through hordes of Vorlon drones, their plasma rifles barely holding the creatures at bay. Finally they reached the ship's core, a pulsating mass of energy that hurt the eyes to look at. Jacob could feel the Nexus resonating with it, the two energies calling to each other across the void. "We have to destroy it," Jacob said, raising his rifle. But before he could fire, a shadow fell over him. He turned to see a towering Vorlon warrior, its chitinous armor gleaming in the sickly light. It held a long, wicked-looking blade in its clawed hands, the edges humming with energy. Jacob fired, but the Vorlon moved with blinding speed, its blade slicing through the plasma bolts like they were nothing. It lunged at Jacob, the sword stabbing towards his heart. But Jacob was ready. He ducked under the blow and lashed out with the Nexus, the orb's energy slamming into the Vorlon's chest. The creature stumbled back, its armor cracked and smoking. Jacob pressed his advantage, the Nexus guiding his movements. He dodged and weaved, striking at the Vorlon's weak points with precision and power. The creature fought back with desperate fury, but it was no match for Jacob and the Nexus. With a final devastating blow, Jacob sent the Vorlon crashing to the ground, its armor shattered. He turned back to the core, the Nexus pulsing with eager anticipation. Together, Jacob and the Nexus unleashed their power, a beam of pure energy lancing into the heart of the Vorlon ship. The core exploded in a blinding flash, the shockwave throwing Jacob and his team off their feet. Around them, the ship began to come apart, its structure disintegrating under the force of the blast. Jacob staggered to his feet, shouting for his team to move. They raced back through the collapsing corridors, dodging falling debris and gouts of flame. They barely made it back to the shuttle before the Vorlon ship tore itself apart, the explosion lighting up the void like a second sun. Jacob sagged into the pilot's seat, his body aching with exhaustion. But even as relief washed over him, the Nexus whispered a warning in his mind. The Vorlons were just the beginning, it said. There were other threats out there, other dangers lurking in the darkness between the stars. Jacob looked out at the Allied fleet, at the ships of a dozen worlds united against a common foe. He knew that this was just the first battle in a war that could span galaxies. But with the Nexus at his side, and the strength of the Zorgon Empire and the Galactic Council behind him, he knew they would face whatever came. For the sake of all life in the universe, they had to. In the wake of the Vorlon attack, the galaxy united under Jacob's leadership. Species that had once been bitter enemies now worked side by side, sharing resources and knowledge in a desperate bid for survival. But even as they prepared for the next assault, the Nexus made a chilling discovery. Delving into the shattered remnants of the Vorlon ship's computer core, it uncovered the true scope of the threat they faced. The Vorlons were merely the vanguard, the first wave of an extragalactic empire that had consumed countless galaxies in its relentless march. An empire of conquest and domination, one that would not stop until every star in the sky bent to its will. Jacob and his allies gathered on the Zorgon homeworld, the weight of this revelation heavy on their shoulders. They knew that conventional tactics would not be enough. The invaders' technology was too advanced, their numbers too vast. "There's only one way," Jacob said, his voice grim. "We have to link our minds, our very essences, through the Nexus, create a galaxy-wide network of consciousness so that every being can contribute their strength to the fight." The Overlord nodded, his eyes hard. "It's a desperate plan, but these are desperate times." The preparations began immediately. The Nexus, its power amplified by Zorgon technology, reached out to every corner of the galaxy. One by one, billions of minds joined the network, their thoughts and memories merging into a vast collective consciousness. But as the final battle approached, Jacob sensed something was wrong. The Nexus, strained by the immense psychic load, had begun to unravel. Its energy dissipated into the void, the network faltering. Jacob felt the Nexus's pain, its desperation. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. The only way to save the galaxy was to merge with the Nexus completely, to become a living conduit for its power. He turned to his friends, his allies, to the Overlord who had become a brother in arms. "This is goodbye," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have to do this, for all of us." The Overlord clasped his hand, his grip fierce. "Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." With a final nod, Jacob turned and strode towards the heart of the Nexus. Its energy swirled around him, welcoming him, pulling him in. He felt his physical form begin to dissolve, his consciousness merging with the ancient AI. There was a blinding flash, a surge of power that shook the stars. Jacob and the Nexus were one, a being of pure energy, transcendent and vast. They turned their gaze to the invading fleet, to the massed ranks of Vorlon ships that filled the sky. With a thought, they unleashed a wave of psychic force, a tsunami of mental energy that swept across the galaxy. The Vorlon ships crumpled like tin cans, their crews driven mad by the psychic onslaught. They turned on each other, firing wildly, tearing their own fleet apart. It was over in moments. The invaders were broken, fleeing back into the void from whence they came. The galaxy was safe for now. But the cost had been high. Jacob, though victorious, knew he could never return to his human form. He was something else now, something greater and yet terribly alien. As the galaxy began to rebuild, he watched from afar. He saw his friends, his allies, working to create a new order, a federation of worlds united in purpose and resolve. He saw the Overlord, his once enemy, now a leader and a statesman, guiding his people towards a brighter future. And though it pained him to be apart from them, Jacob knew this was how it had to be. He was the guardian now, the silent watcher. He would guide and protect them from afar, for as long as the stars shone in the sky. His journey was not over. The galaxy would face many more challenges in the years to come. But for now there was hope. Hope for a better tomorrow, a future free from the shadow of war. And so Jacob watched and waited and planned, ready for whatever the cosmos might throw at him next. The Vorlon threat was just the beginning, he knew, but with the power of the Nexus at his command, he would be ready. He would fight, as he always had, for the sake of all life in the galaxy. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.